Hi honey bunnies, this year for Self-Love September I have asked other people to share their stories using video format on YouTube or somewhere else, blog posts, just tweeting about it, putting something on Instagram, basically just sharing your own challenges, your high points, your low points when it comes to integrating self-love into your lives, using it as a daily practice, understanding the meaning and the value of it. And that has been really eye-opening for me. I definitely expected that it would be. I 100% expected that it would be really profound to be able to absorb other people's stories and see where other people are coming from and where you guys are on your journeys. I think it's been amazing. And I did make the decision when I realised I wanted other people to bring their stories in and I wanted to put the call out for that to happen, I made the decision that I would have to be a little bit more honest about where I've been and what my story is and why I grappled for so long with self-love. I was telling somebody fairly recently that I have noticed that some of the things that I've put out on my channel and my blog that have been the most obviously helpful for people have been my own personal stories, and I wouldn't actually have expected that at the beginning because I always knew that my channel was going to be quite instructional. I intended primarily to explain things and break things down in an accessible way, and those things would be things that I already had learned or had some degree of proficiency in. So it was kind of going to be about showing people what I know and then kind of absorbing what other people know and getting into the community aspect, but it was never going to be like a super confessional situation where I was going to give everybody all the nitty-gritty bits of my own past. That was never how it was going to work. However, obviously it has come up over time. I've spoken about my own difficulties with mental health, with self-harm and that kind of thing, and with disordered eating. And I've definitely noticed that a lot of the comments and the feedback that I receive that is about how helpful something was are geared towards the concept of being able to empathise with a story I've told, people resonating with stories that I've told about my own life. So there's been a lot of comments like, thank you so much for speaking about this. It means a lot to know that you've been through it too. It's so nice to be able to listen to someone's story that I resonate with, and now I feel okay about the fact that I've been through it and I feel less ashamed or less alone. And that's been an eye-opening part of my online journey, is just realising how meaningful it is for somebody when you take to your platform to talk about what you've been through and it resonates with them. So that's one of the biggest reasons why I'm doing this today. I'm not going to be able to talk about every single part of my mental health journey, everything that I've been through. It would take way too long. It would be probably a 10 video series, I think, to break everything down and give you guys the 411 on the entire thing. But I'm going to talk about a few of the key things that I think it might be helpful for you to know. I often tell people that I feel that I first started acknowledging that I had depression and that I experienced periods of depression when I was 10. Looking back now over the timeline of my childhood, things are definitely a little bit blurred. I do not have it all straight. I do not, have a good idea of what age I was at every turn and with every experience. But I would definitely say that 10 years old was the first time that I consciously thought about killing myself. I definitely experienced suicidal ideation at that age. I also experienced bouts of insomnia and night terrors at that age. It was not something I ever spoke to my mother or my siblings about, so nobody ever knew. It was basically just me sweating one out in bed at night, just completely freaked out by what I was experiencing, and I never got any help with that. I never voiced it, and that was largely because I didn't really want to bother my mum. I didn't know how to explain what I was going through. I didn't feel very close to my mother at that age. I didn't feel very close to my stepfather at all. And so I just kept these things to myself. I hung on to them, and I definitely think they were part of the depression I experienced at that young age as well. I always experienced being blue. I always experienced these periods of just being very low, either suicidal ideation or just thoughts of complete hopelessness, feelings of numbness, feelings of not being at all connected to the world. And like I said, I think I consciously realised I was having these experiences when I was 10. That's the first time that I, first of all, thought about dying, and second of all recognised that I was having these experiences, I was having these phases, but I'm sure that I did experience them earlier. I don't remember what age I was when my mum first said to me that my nanny was very depressed and had mental health issues, that my mother had suffered with depression and also had self-harm throughout her life, and I don't remember what age I was when she began to explain that her siblings had also been through periods of mental health issues, but I know that it was probably some time after her mother died died, and my nanny died when I was 14 years old. And it was at that point that my mum began to be a little bit more open about the fact that there were problems like that running through her family line, and that she had dealt with a lot of these issues herself as well. That was when I started to make a few connections, and things started to become a little bit easier to understand. By that point, I was going to a school counsellor to talk about some of my own issues. I had a lot of issues with identity. I had issues with kind of trying to understand my sexual orientation. I had issues fitting in at school. The other kids didn't understand me. I was definitely the weirdo. I would never ever say that I suffered at the hands of bullies though. I was always very, very into my individuality, and I knew that I would never succumb to, you know, putting myself in a box and trying to be like other people. I was very defiant like that. And so I actually found belonging with different groups of kids from different years or from different schools quite quickly, because I didn't succumb to any of the bullshit in my own year and in my own class at school. I was very clear that I wanted to be me, and I had a real kind of fuck you attitude about that even from the first. So I definitely did find people to play with, other people that were kind of really rebellious and really against trying to fit in and trying to be what the cool kids kind of thought we should be. I started self-harming when I was 14 years old in order to deal with the incredible bouts of depression that I was going through, that I had been through, you know, for quite some time at that point. The way that I started to self-harm was actually quite by accident. I was running out of my house through the back door via the utility room in my house. It was kind of like a glorified shed that was attached to our house. I was running through to get away from my stepfather, who I'd just had a really like vicious argument with, and as I was running I kind of scraped my arm on the door on the way out, and it was a really rough door that was splintered and wooden, and I cut my arm. I made several kind of grazes on my arm that started to bleed, and I recognised in my head that there was a great deal of relief in that for me, that felt somehow kind of comforting. It felt like a pressure had been lifted. And so after that I started to use disposable razor blades to do the same thing that I had just kind of accidentally done. And it was about the age of kind of 15, 16 that I realised that self-harm was actually a thing. I started to see a few things about it on television and that kind of thing. I think I might have seen a leaflet about it in a doctor's surgery. Just little kind of things came into the culture that made me realise that other people did this kind of thing as well. And unfortunately all that served to do was to inspire me to make my methods of self-harming more sophisticated. So I started to get hold of real razor blades, like old school Wilkinson's razor blades, to self-harm instead. There definitely was a time in my life where I cloaked myself in my mental health issues. I shrouded myself in them. I used them to prop up my sense of identity. I felt very much as though they were a part of who I were. I think at one point in my life, for quite a long stage of my life, I felt like they were kind of the most intrinsic and the most kind of pure part of me, the part of me that really was me, if that makes sense. So there was definitely a long time where I had no interest in healing. I had no interest in getting over self-harm. When I was 15, I started dating a girl who was a couple of years older than me, and that was my first kind of serious relationship that lasted for a long time. It lasted for 3 years, and one of the ways in which me and this girl actually initially bonded was because she had self-harm scars on her arms, and later on when I became friends with her I realised that she did actively self-harm as well. And this was like really, really difficult because pretty much as soon as my mum recognised that my girlfriend had self-harm scars on her arms, my mum basically decided that the only reason that I had ever started self-harming is because of Jodie, that it was just basically that I was copying her, that I was imitating her. And that narrative went on for quite a while, and that form of denial that my mum had, that I actually had started self-harming quite a bit sooner and that I'd kept it from her all that time, which I had been very capable of doing. I was very capable at hiding the self-harm for a long time. But when I was sort of about like 16 and my mum found out I was self-harming, she was very quick to blame Jodie. She was very quick to say that I never self-harmed before I met Jodie, and that was kind of a really harmful, damaging narrative, that she didn't actually believe that I had been doing it from that young. And actually my relationship with Jodie blossomed because she could understand my self-harm, far from being the catalyst for it. When I got a little bit older and I started really struggling at school, and I had to leave school before my A-level results, I had to leave school before I sat my A-levels, and it was evident that I was really, really suffering, that I was experiencing things that were stopping me from being able to function. That was when I switched from seeing my self-harm as a part of my identity to seeing it as a burden and an embarrassment. I saw it as a weakness. I definitely worried that I was a burden on my parents and that I was never going to be able to do anything with my life. I started to experience psychosis, which I never shared with my mother at the time, but eventually I did share it with a friend, and it did get to the point where my friend actually took me to the doctor's surgery and made me get an appointment with the doctor, and it was at that point that the doctor referred me for a much more intensive form of counselling. Up until that point, I'd only really visited the school counsellor on and off, and as soon as we started to get into anything more in depth, I remember just leaving and like not going to the appointments because I didn't really want to face what was going on with me. I wanted to kind of keep it and shroud myself in it. But at the point when I was 17, when I really started to experience things other than depression, like psychosis, and the insomnia started to come back as well, and I definitely would say that I experienced my first states of mania between the ages of 17 and 19. That was the point at which I did have more intensive therapy, and I did start to really worry about myself, and I worried about my future. When I was 17, I tried to take my own life. I don't want to talk about the ins and outs of that. I don't really think I want to get into the details of that. I don't really see how that would be useful. But I did end up in hospital, and my mother was worried sick and really furious with me as well, just completely disgusted with me that I tried to take my own life. She was really pissed off about that. But my mum would definitely say now in no uncertain terms that she was not there at that point in my life for me. She was not emotionally available to me. My mother and I still lived under the same roof at that time, but we had completely separate lives, and she did not really have an awareness of what I was going through. She had a very liminal awareness of what I was going through, and she still had a lot of shit to work out herself, and was definitely not somebody that could help me, and I definitely couldn't help her. We both were still really struggling with a lot of stuff. So, there's that. The issues that I went through with psychosis and with kind of dissociation and checking out, and the issues I went through with these prolonged periods of depression where I had no urge to do anything creative, and I was really fearful of people, and I was quite tactophobic as well. I was very afraid of being touched. I did not want to be touched. I did not so much as want to be hugged by a family member for quite a long time during that period of my life. All of those things were things that I felt were embarrassing. They were things that I thought of as weaknesses. They were things that did not align with the image that I had of myself in my head. And I remember at a certain point reading a biography of Virginia Woolf, the very big, thick biography by Hermione Lee. And I remember inside that biography it said that Virginia Woolf very much felt similarly about her issues with psychosis, with madness, essentially. She was very reluctant to talk about them and open up about them because she felt that they kind of painted a picture of her as this kind of imbecilic nutcase, and it really wasn't what she thought of herself as being. She saw herself as being, intelligent and worldly and capable and creative, and she tried very much to shove her madness under the rug, her psychosis, her struggles with mental health under the rug, because they did not paint the appropriate portrait, and that really stopped her from being able to get a lot of the help that she needed. And I remember reading that at the time and really resonating with it and thinking, yeah, I'm definitely downplaying what I'm going through, and I'm definitely struggling to keep these therapy appointments because I don't like talking about what I'm experiencing. And I definitely had a lot of embarrassment with the first few therapists that I saw. I was just mortified. I remember I would go so red talking about these things that I was seeing and hearing, and these kind of thought processes that I was entertaining in my mind, because I actually knew that they were just in my head. And actually when I was 19 and I was finally told that I had been diagnosed 2 years previously with psychotic depression, a lot of things actually made sense and came together for me, because I was told, and I did my own reading and kind of realised that psychotic depression is often misdiagnosed as either schizophrenia or sometimes as bipolar disorder. And the reason that it can be misdiagnosed as schizophrenia is because a lot of the auditory and visual hallucinations and a lot of the delusions, they are similar to the ones experienced by schizophrenics. But the key difference is that psychotic depressives are very often very much aware that this shit is only in their mind. And it doesn't mean that it's not disturbing or confusing, but psychotic depressives know that it's in their head, and they are therefore very, very reluctant to seek treatment for it. And their psychosis is actually a kind of manifestation of their depression, and so they kind of really struggle to understand that it's all part of the same thing. So they may be willing to discuss their depression, but not so willing to discuss the psychotic symptoms that they're experiencing. And that means a lot of psychotic depressives suffer for a long time just purely from sheer embarrassment and not feeling like it's appropriate to talk about these things that they are aware are not part of reality. So that can definitely be difficult. I self-harmed from the age of 14 right up until the age of 21, and in my first serious relationship with a guy that started when I was 19, just about to turn 20, I very clearly said to him, I have no fucking interest in ceasing self-harm. Self-harm is what I do, it's a part of who I am. I don't want to have any discussions about it, and I don't want you trying to help me to stop. So I was very clear on that, and by that point I'd had quite a bit of therapy, some of which had been successful to a liminal extent, and most of which had been like completely ineffective. I had been on antidepressants for a while when I got with my first boyfriend, but I was still very clear, you know, that I was going to keep hold of the self-harm, that nothing was going to take me off of that particular gravy train. So I still was heavily into it at that point. Sadly, my self-harm has been used against me in a couple of emotionally abusive connections in my life. In particular, one emotionally abusive connection with a family member who I now no longer speak to. She used my self-harm against me several times in arguments. She used my experiences with mental health against me in arguments, just accusing me of being mad, asking me whether or not I was going to go and cut myself, or saying I should just go and cut myself. Just basically very much taking that information that she knew about me and using it as ammunition. I experienced this again in an emotionally abusive relationship with a partner. You know, it was unpleasant, put it that way. It was definitely used as ammo from time to time. Unfortunately, one of the emotionally abusive relationships I had was with that first girlfriend of mine, and she was very much kind of, I mean, we forged our connection on our pain, on our sickness, on our depression, and on our self-harm. And in the end, she definitely used that against me. She used it to intimidate me out of leaving the relationship. It's hard to explain. It was a real cyclone of bad shit. But she ended up betraying me and lying to me and very much playing games with me. And now when I look back over that situation, a lot of those games were to do with the things that intrinsically held us together: depression, mental illness, self-harm. Those things were used to lasso me back into the connection and to keep me kind of drinking from that nasty tap, you know, that obsessive, deeply dysfunctional, unhealthy tap that was our love. So that was you know, in no uncertain terms, an emotionally abusive connection. Not just for that reason, but that is a reason that I'm willing to talk about in the context of this video. I can't remember if it was the age of 22 or 23 right now off the top of my head. I'd need to like look at the timeline, if you will, and I can't really think right now, but it was at that age that I decided to stop taking antidepressants completely. I personally felt that they were having a numbing effect on me, and they weren't allowing me to get to the root of some of the problems that I was having. And it was at this same time that I met a man that I ended up being with for 4 years of my life, and he was the first person I've been with who had a really high level of emotional intelligence and had a vested interest in spirituality and in well-being and mental well-being. And he'd also been through a lot of his own difficulties. He experienced 5 years of really intense, really difficult depression that ruled his life, and he had gone through his own journey. He was a bit older than me when we met. He was like 27 when we met, and he'd been through his own journey, and he was able to talk to me and level with me about the self-harm in a way that made sense to me. And so I stopped self-harming pretty much immediately as soon as I befriended this guy, and very shortly afterwards got into a relationship with him. And I dealt with a lot of my problems while I was with him. However, I definitely feel, looking back in hindsight, and I've known this for a while now, that I stopped the self-harm because I wanted to not please him necessarily, but what he was saying made sense to me. And also he let me know in no uncertain terms that whenever I cut myself, I cut him. You know, like, that's the nature of how he felt for me. That was how strongly he felt for me. That was how much he loved me. And so, you know, I stopped self-harming immediately. But the thing is, self-harm is not a cause. It's just a symptom of deep causes. So when you stop self-harming like that without really addressing the roots of the problem and doing some work to get to the bottom of why you self-harm and what it is that you need to do instead of self-harming, like, what is it that the self-harm is providing you with, and how can that be provided to you in a way that is healthy and long-term and makes sense, rather than just a temporary secret fix that keeps messing your skin up but not really getting you anywhere. If you don't address that, then you're going to end up turning to another coping mechanism instead. And I very quickly did. Pretty much as soon as I stopped self-harming, I began to abuse laxatives and I began to restrict my food and that kind of thing. And that ended up being like a year and a half of disordered eating, and I lost quite a lot of weight. And so that happened while I was with this guy, and eventually, you know, we had to have an honest discussion about it, and I had to agree to begin to recover and to begin to put on weight again, which was really, really fucking hard for me. And it was at that point that I kind of recognised that I had been using the self-harm as a coping mechanism, which I had immediately replaced with another coping mechanism, which seemed like the kind of thing that I could get away with and the kind of thing that I could continue to sustain. Both of these coping mechanisms were about control, and I know that now. I found that any time that I felt like my life was out of control, any time that I felt like I wasn't in control of the narrative, or any time where I couldn't control my feelings, I couldn't control my emotions, or I couldn't control what kind of support system I had, if I felt like I was in free fall, if I was floating in a void and I couldn't grab onto anything, it was like I used these coping mechanisms as a kind of central post, a mast that I could grab onto, and they gave me that sense of sovereignty again. And it was a totally false economy. It was a completely false economy. They did not give me any sovereignty, really. They just enslaved me. But at the time, I felt like if I take this blade to my arm, or if I step on the scale and I've lost another 3 pounds or whatever, that's my sense of control. That's me standing in my power. And it's such a false currency. It is fake currency. It's counterfeit. But it feels so real. It feels so fucking real, but it's not. Like I said, I did quite a bit of kind of healing and coming to an understanding while I was in this 4-year relationship, but it was after it ended that things really began to snowball. Like, I really got into my healing journey then. I really, really went there. I think the self-love thing reached its absolute zenith for me. It reached the pinnacle after I came out of my relationship with this man that I had been with, that had given me so much support and really created the safe space for me to begin the journey of healing and to understand more about how I wanted to heal and what I had been going through, and that I was depressed and that it was okay. All of that stuff, it started with him, but it ended when the relationship ended, and it ended very suddenly. It was unexpected for both of us. I would say it was deeply traumatic for both of us. And I really feel like after that happened, that was when I realised that it's easy to formulate a practice of self-love and a belief about self-love if you've got somebody standing by your side, somebody who is there for you, who shares things with you, that you feel you have a Siamese connection with. But when you're alone, when you're on the floor, when your future is a black hole and you feel like you have nothing left, and that person that you thought was always going to be one of the central figures in your life isn't there anymore, that's where shit gets real. That is where the deeper layers of self-love need to be accessed, and I feel like I very much did that, and it was so worth it, and it was so incredible. So I came out of that relationship and I just had this deeper work that I knew that I had to do, and that's when I started picking up tarot again as well, and tarot is definitely a tool that I use to my advantage. I had to go through a lot of self-forgiveness, a lot of feelings of accepting that it had been a long road for me, and that I had worried a lot of people, and that I had stopped myself from taking the opportunities I could have taken, and that I had been lost for a long time. I felt a lot of blame towards myself for this, and I want to be really honest as well in saying that when you've been through a massive massive period of mental health challenges, when you have gone through a total breakdown that has meant that you tried to take your own life, you left your education, everybody kind of went on, everybody from your, you know, time at school went on and advanced beyond you, and you just ended up kind of like being 22, 23 years old and just working at the video shop and not really knowing what you're doing with your life kind of thing. The video shop, that's so retro, but I'm like nearly 32 now, so it's true, I worked at the video shop. When that happens to you and you come out of all that and you realise, like, I need to accept what I've been through now and I need to dig through it, you are absolutely tempted to go back to these former coping mechanisms that were so damaging for you, but that felt so effective. And I want to be honest about that when I talk to you guys about healing and about setting yourself free and about empowerment and all of that kind of thing. I never, ever, ever want anybody to think that I am healed beyond any possible trigger that I could experience, that I am never depressed anymore, that I never sometimes have a desire to restrict my food again. I do. I'm not ascended. I'm not ascended beyond what it is to be human. I have spoken on the channel about the fact that I believe myself to be somebody who deals with depression and that I'm not looking for the ultimate cure for it. I believe I've had it for far too long to believe that I can simply slip out from its lasso. But that's not the point for me. The point is to find those ways of dealing with it, is to remind myself that I don't need those crappy fake coping mechanisms anymore, and I can open up and I can be communicative and I can connect with other people, and I can use empathy as an elixir, and I can use art as an elixir. These things are available to me. I do not need to hack myself up. I do not need to starve myself. But I want to be honest about the fact that yes, I do sometimes want to reach for those coping mechanisms. Absolutely, I want to restrict my food sometimes. Absolutely, I have felt like going back to the blade. But I just want to be really honest about the fact that you can go through dark times and hold yourself. And that is what I have learned, that you can talk to yourself, you can be with yourself, that you don't have to keep taking that road. This is a hard video to make. Like I said, there is so much that I could talk about, so much that I could say, so much more I could share, but I wanted to give you just kind of like the bones of where I've been and what I've been through. I see my mental health challenges now as a rich part of my tapestry. I see my difficulties, my breakdown and my suicide attempt as what has led me here and as what has led me through the process of being a spiritual counsellor and hopefully a guide and a helper for others. It's what made me start this YouTube channel. It's what made me start getting really honest about where I've been. It's what's made me want to reach out to other people who might be going through similar stuff, and so I see it as a very valuable part of my journey now. But it took me a while to get to that point. Of course, it's not something that you can feel overnight, absolutely not. When you are dealing with mental health issues, when you're dealing with that kind of thing, it can definitely leave you vulnerable to emotionally abusive connections, where a lot of the abuse is based on using those things against you, making you feel like you are not strong enough or healthy enough to move away from those people, or you are not kind of strong enough to defend your boundary, which oftentimes you are not, and they are aware of that. So that can definitely lead into emotionally abusive territory. I see my mental health struggles as a part of me, but not the part of me that writes the narrative. It's not the whole narrative. It's not the only part of my story. But I know that I wouldn't be where I am now, and I wouldn't have learned what I've learned now, and I wouldn't be as good a listening ear for my clients and for my friends and for my partner now if I hadn't have gone through those things. And so I do value those things, and you can get to a point where you do value those things. But it took me a long time to build up self-love, and it took me a long time to accept myself and to forgive myself for what I saw as the waste of so much of my life, and to forgive myself for what I saw as my great weakness. And I just hope that relaying these experiences and talking about them has been helpful for some of you out there. And so this has been one of my self-love stories, and until next time, very, very much love and blessed be. Thank you.